And our first speaker is going to be Pia Waugh. Pia will be talking on Geeks Rule Over Kings, the Distributed Democracy, which I'm sure many people are interested in. Pia is known for her work in open government, open source community development, software freedom, and generally trying to make the world a better place. She currently works for IGMO as looking at IT policy across the federal government, and used to work as a policy advisor to Senator Kate Lundy. And in 2009 she co-developed the internationally awarded public sphere consultation methodology with said senator. So can we please give a warm welcome to Pia.
God, this room's really full. Thank you all very much for coming. I will just give the caveat that I'm having to give to everyone this week, which is I've slept an average of 4 hours a night for the last 6 weeks, and I'm babysitting at night. So I'm a little bit more random than usual, but actually I think that's going to turn out pretty well for this particular talk. So see how we go. What I wanted to do, I also had beautiful slides that I couldn't get done because of the 4 hours sleeping. So, Geeks Rule Over Kings. What I wanted to do through this talk was to go through the concepts that are basically shifting us to effectively the head of the food chain, which is a fascinating place to be for a lot of geeks who are not really used to being in that particular position, and frankly don't necessarily want to be in that position in a lot of cases, and sometimes probably abuse the position. But the internet has, as you all completely appreciate more than most people, basically brought everyone close together. If you guys want to come down, there's some seats still here. Please, yeah. I should be the only one uncomfortably standing, it's all good. It's brought everyone really close, much closer. It's meant that information is available to everyone. Anyone can publish, anyone can talk, anyone can communicate with anyone. But it's mostly brought us closer together as the technical communities around the world. We can work very effectively with each other because we are technically literate. I was on a panel a few weeks ago about privacy. I found myself in the weird position of being asked to join the Australian Privacy Foundation board, which I'm looking forward to being able to contribute to after I send Tim Berners-Lee home. We're having a public debate about the definition of privacy, and it was really quite fascinating because a lot of, some people said, well, there is no privacy. Some people said, oh, well, everything should be private. Some people were talking about privacy being, your personal data or your location, all these things. For me, the definition was actually quite simple, and I'd love to sort of get your feedback after this talk. But for me, the definition is actually a combination of only two things. First of all, your personal preferences. So for me, I actually feel like a lot of my life is online, is probably fairly evident. I blog, I'm on social media. I don't really have. I have a lot of information about myself publicly available. But my location, I actually find a very personal thing. Now, of course, I know people can track my personal tracking device, which you might call a phone, at any point in time. I don't tend to say, hey, I'm on Foursquare, woo, I'm mayor of this town, whatever this town is. For me, that's very personal information. For me, all of the metadata about my interactions with other people in aggregate is the most personal type of information. So I'm very, very aware of some of that, and I try to limit some of those things, but for other people it'll be something else. So it's very much a personal definition. But the second thing, and this very much talks to the first one, is your technical literacy. Because if you're not technology literate, then your understanding about what information is being captured about you is actually very low. And so your ability to protect yourself is very low. Your ability to understand the digital signature that you're leaving is actually very low. So for me, it's a combination of those two things is basically what defines as privacy, which is terrifying because, of course, it means that there's no baseline. It means that anyone can be, anyway. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about two things in particular. The distributed democracy is sort of the big answer, and of course the name of the talk gives that away slightly. It's not necessarily the big answer, but we'll get to that. But I also want to talk a little bit about, internet freedom, which is very much related to that. So in the first instance, I believe one of the reasons we're living in the most exciting of times is because we have seen in our lifetime, and it's continuing onwards and upwards, the complete massive distribution of pretty much every traditional and traditionally centralised and traditionally closely guarded bastion of power to everyone. We've seen all of those things actually distributed. You used to have publishing was a very centralised thing. If you owned the means to create information and to distribute information, then you controlled the information flow. But now anyone can publish. The means of communication, when you owned the mechanism, if you had access to be able to communicate because you could afford the sending of a message over a ship or over a carrier pigeon or whatever it is you had access to. But it was very rare for people to communicate outside their very narrow geographic boundaries in the previous times. And now anyone can communicate with anyone effectively. Access and monitoring, the ability to access information, the ability to monitor information is not a centralised thing. Anyone can monitor anyone. Has anyone here done much philosophy or political science stuff? Yay! So how many of you know Foucault? Okay, so just for everyone else, there's this dude Foucault. He's very hard to read, I wouldn't bother, but You'll summarise. So I'm going to summarise very rapidly. He actually had a lot of really cool concepts, so I actually do recommend going and reading papers about what Foucault said, because they're usually pretty good. But one of the concepts he had, which was a brilliant concept, was he took so there was a thing called the panopticon. The panopticon is a design of a jail that was done many, many years before Foucault. I can walk around, can't I?
Yeah.
Not too much?
Yeah, walk around a little bit. The reason why I say is I don't want you to go out of camera.
Well, you tell me what, you just yell. All right? Am I good? Am I good? Am I good? Okay. So I'll go to there, all right, and...
Do some martial arts.
No. I need, yeah, probably will actually. All right, just so I know how much I can walk. All right, sorry, it'll help me stay awake, I promise. My natural enthusiasm will probably also do that. So the panopticon was a model for a jail, right? And the whole concept of this was the government at the time, I believe it was in the UK, they basically had a strict budget, and they were trying to cut down on resources that it took to do all their basic services. So this dude came up with this model of the design of a jail so that a very small number of jailers could actually control a large number of people, right? So they made it so that a prisoner would not know if they were being observed or not. And I mean, back in those days, you didn't have electricity or cameras or any of that kind of stuff, right? But they used, maybe they had electricity. Anyway, they used light and they used angles and they used all these things so that a jailer could potentially be watching you and you wouldn't know. And and the concept of this design was that if you didn't know you were being watched, then you would actually behave yourself better. You would actually be a little more conservative. You would do the right thing, where right is defined by someone else. Anyway, so Foucault took this very physical concept of this jail and basically said, because he was around sort of when CCTV was really starting to take off, and he said that the panopticon was a metaphor for CCTV, because if everyone knows they're being watched, then everyone starts to be just a little bit more what they think normal should be. Everyone starts to... Sorry?
AKA London.
Okay, yeah, indeed. Have you seen the picture, my favourite picture of all time, of... George Orwell Place with a CCTV camera right there. It's like so brilliant. Anyway, so this concept that you by always being watched, you're going to actually self-limit, which in a lot of ways is far more effective than any military power or any enforcement power or any of those kinds of things. Because if you think that you're being watched at any point in time, then you're going to maybe tone down some of your behaviours, which might be plausibly an explanation for us getting a little bit more conservative over the recent decades. Maybe, I don't know. So that was his concept. For me, I think Foucault, I think he's died now, but would have loved the internet because it turns out completely on its head. Because we can watch the government. We can watch, well, then you can watch each other, then you can watch, everyone watches everyone, which can be both terrifying and liberating. I got into a big argument with Jeff Houston, Mr. IPv6 is going to kill us all, who I love, and he's a wonderful person, but he's definitely Mr. Doomsday on IPv6 for good reason. And we got into this big argument because he's like, but it'll create this situation where no one is able, where everyone has a history and you will always be judged on everything you've ever done. But my argument is that we've got to a point where we're pretending to be normal, but no one actually is. And actually we'll have to go through a maturity phase where people start to go, well, yeah, I inhaled. And that's okay. So I think in the long term it's going to be good, but yes, I think there will be blood in the meantime. So we've had this massive distribution of monitoring, just to go off on a tangent. The last one, so publishing, communications, monitoring / access, and the fourth one is enforcement. I find this fascinating, that enforcement used to be who had the biggest weapon, who had the biggest sword, who had the biggest gun a little bit later on. But now, anyone with a computer can disrupt an economy, can disrupt a business, can disrupt, the power. And that's can disrupt the information flow, can disrupt the communications. It is a fascinating time we live in, that enforcement, right, as a traditionally closely guarded mechanism of power, has been distributed to everybody. Everybody that's technology literate, and that takes me back to point A. But very, very interesting. And the final one, of course, which we're not quite there yet, is, and this is going to be the big ground-shaking thing of our generation, is the distribution of property. Because, of course, 3D printing at the moment, I was in a room with a bunch of technologists and copyright people, which, of course, is the most comfortable of places to sit. And the 3D printing people are saying, but, the copyright people are saying, this is going to destroy the world and our business models and all the things. And the 3D printing people are saying, oh, but don't worry, we're just printing, little chocolate motifs and imperfect pictures of bunnies and stuff. So it's okay, just calm down, stop trying to get on our nerves. But being very nice. And I just stood up and I just said, well, yes, it's going to disrupt your business model, but there's a possibility it'll disrupt poverty and hunger. And what do we actually care about more? Like, seriously. Particularly when you start to combine it with nanotechnology. And I know this is a long way off in the future, and we'll get into the debates about, plausibility at some point. But who's read Diamond Age? Yeah, rockin'. So, the concept for everyone else is that, anyone can just print anything. Your bandwidth is not measured in megabits per second. It's actually measured in effectively atomic material. And so you've got molecular material, sorry. So effectively you've got your 3D printer, and you can print a new chair. When it breaks, you just print whatever it is that you need. You print your food. And the really super rich in that society are the people that can afford to have a person actually make something crafted personally, which we're already starting to go down that track, which I find interesting. But if you can feed something into a decompiler that recompiles molecular matter and then get food at the end, we're about to go into a very, very interesting age. But the massive distribution of property, right? Property has been the basis of so many things, so many political premises, so many power premises, so many wars. What can happen if we can actually, 3D print oil or 3D print, I don't know, like anything. But not that we want to keep going in an oil economy, but you know what I'm saying. So we've got this massive distribution of publishing, communications, monitoring, enforcement, and property on its way, right? Very interesting times we're going into. There are still some mechanisms that have, a lot of mechanisms that have a certain amount of control over us, though, regardless of this massive distribution of power. There's the way that the internet is run, of course, is a very interesting one, and I'll get into that. There's governments, obviously, who purport to work on our behalf. And to be very fair, and I work in the public service, and I purposefully went and worked in a politician's office, a very good politician with integrity that I would go work for again, even though a lot of her peers not so much. Because I wanted to understand how the legislative and executive wings of government work, how something goes from being an idea to actually influencing us. And there's a whole talk in that, but I won't go into that now. But then I wanted to understand the administrative arm of government, so I've gone into the public service. And in both areas, though, there are a lot of people who really genuinely want to do good. Personally, I think there's always going to be a role for a geographically bound governance model of some sort. Sorry? Yes, and I'll tell you why. Well, until the singularity, when we upload our consciousnesses and we don't have garbage anymore, sure. Well,
which computer are you on?
Sorry?
Which host computer are you on?
And we'll get to that, because I'm not a lobster. I'm not going to get bound by NT. Anyway, I won't go into that conversation. So there's too much science fiction out there that's just so awesome. Wherever I have garbage, it's going to make sense for me to figure out how me and my neighbour and my group of neighbours can actually do that in an equitable, scalable way. That for me, the point of government, as in the geospatially defined jurisdictionally ones that we have now, it is actually useful because it provides a basic level of health education. It provides a baseline for society. It should. It doesn't always, and it certainly fails in a lot of ways. But the concept that it provides a baseline from which everyone can then prosper is actually not a bad baseline. I like that baseline. People get into arguments about what government should or shouldn't do. And I think part of the problem we have in this country is we haven't actually, as a society, decided what what we think is the baseline that we should agree. Pretty much every Australian, even our most hardcore conservatives, would be seen as raving social libertarians by pretty much any American, right? Because we expect free healthcare, we expect public education. Sorry?
But that's America.
No, I completely see where you're going, and I don't think that we should, sorry, the comment for the people recording is that, yeah, but that's America. But we don't want to obviously compare ourselves to just one or two countries or any lower common denominators. We want to define what we want. Was that a bit too cheeky? Okay, so but we haven't had that conversation in this country. I mean, okay, I'm not going to go into the spiel about how this country was created because there's other things to say and not that much time. But it is interesting to note that we've not really had that debate. There isn't that common understanding. So people sort of sway between big government, small government, you know, too big, too small. But it's like, yeah, but what are we trying to achieve? You get a lot of language in government about productivity gains and efficiencies and value for money and all these things. But it's like, yeah, but what's the point? What's the actual point? And for me, the point is to actually create, to have services that help people have a good life, effectively, and not, you know, and to help make sure that there is a baseline so that everyone has an opportunity to actually live a good life. That's why I'm working for the public service. So mechanisms and controls, but I think we're always going to need that way to scale. But the problem is that jurisdictionally, or geographically bound jurisdictions do not represent our online lives at all. In fact, they almost work against that. They're all trying to effectively shift the blame where it suits to shift the blame, and trying to take control of the Wild West where they think that they can. And almost we're subject to the lowest common denominator, because whichever country has the crappiest laws, and there's many countries with crappy laws around the internet and around technology, you can effectively get done by, because it's like, oh, well, that routed through our country once. I mean, does everyone remember the whole, I think it's still going on, but like a lot of traffic of a particular phone carrier, you know, started just getting routed through the US for no apparent reason, but that made all that content subject to the Patriot Act. And it's like, well, let's think about this just for like 2 minutes before we do it. There's a lot of question around the validity of my geospatial government participating in a global discussion about internet policy and purporting to represent my best interests when they're thinking from a geographic jurisdictional perspective. Now, I'll give you what got me started in this whole rant about 2 years ago, and started all the thoughts happening, was there was a speech at the EG8, which was the, because, you know, if it's got an E in front of it, obviously it's, you know, internets. They had the big G8 meeting, and it was being hosted by France. So President Sarkozy decided to have the EG8 beforehand, and he gave this speech which was just amazing, right? The first half of his speech, because of what it represented, not because I agree with it, the first half of his speech was, the internet has done all these great things for our society, for us, you know, and he had all these internet luminaries in the crowd, and he's like, thank you so much for what you have done. This has changed, you know, the world and the economics and the prosperity and blah, blah, blah. And then he got to this point, and he did this fascinating segue where he said, so, because governments are the only legitimate representative bodies of the people, it now makes sense that it's so ubiquitous that we should step in and start running it and be in control of it and make sure it runs. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't it fascinating? So then the second half of his speech was about all the ways that we needed to start to control the internet. Fascinating. So for me, the fact that he said that publicly, I know a lot of them think that, but the fact that he said that publicly and was so comfortable to think that that was an okay thing to say publicly was a turning point, I believe. So, and it was certainly a turning point for me. It got me all riled up. The idea that governments think that so the premise is wrong, right? Let's just go back to the very concept that he's saying. The premise that is the only representative body for us, well, we can represent ourselves, actually. We have this mechanism to do that now. It's called the internet. You may have heard of it. It got me thinking about the role of governments and what's happening. So who here was amongst the very brave and frustrated and few of us that were fighting the US Free Trade Agreement when it came out? Yeah. Gosh, that was frustrating. So one of the things that lesson, plus watching ACTA, plus watching TPP, and plus going back and doing study into politics and history and all the things that I'm studying at the moment on top of everything else, is that trade agreements don't need to have parliamentary support in Australia. So basically, they don't need to be subject to any of the democratic processes whatsoever. And yet, so where I'm going with this is that mechanisms that actually control us or impact upon us or shape our lives isn't, you've got internet bodies, you've got governments, obviously corporates, not a lot we can do about them apart from, shaming them into trying to do the right thing every so often. But, because there isn't really, they will do the same thing but in terms of jurisdiction shopping to find the appropriate jurisdiction to do what they want to do. So we don't really have a lot of control over what corporates do. But the thing that bothers me is that the other governments, the impact on our lives through things like trade agreements, through things like user licenses agreements, through things that we don't, that there is no process to say, actually that's kind of not cool and maybe we should think about this and maybe we should have some transparency and accountability to that process. So trade agreements was a fascinating one. And so I'm going to jump into the internet freedoms first, and then I'm going to jump into the possible solution for getting a bit more international representativeness second. So at the IGF is the Internet Governance Forum, I think, is a body that sits under the United Nations, and it's kind of this body made up of people from governments all around the world who get together and talk about what are the problems facing us with the internet today and what can we do about it. And it's an interesting body. I mean, like a lot of those kind of things, it moves very slowly and ponderously. But they had an IGF meeting in Australia, which was going to form the Australian feedback into the global IGF meeting that was going to happen very soon thereafter. And one of the things that I'd been playing with, which I ran a session on and we got some fantastic feedback, which I'm going to go through in a second, was the concept that everyone talks about open internet versus closed internet. And there's, I'm going to run out of battery, hold on. No, I've got 27 minutes, it's okay. So open internet versus closed internet. And the problem, of course, is it's a debate between geeks and spooks. Most people are not involved in this debate. Most people don't understand the debate. Most people don't care. They switch off because they go, oh, well, it's just technology, someone else will deal with that. It doesn't impact me. And the problem is that it's a debate that has so far not really worked in the favour of people who are trying to create the open internet, really, because who knows what it means? Okay, you want an open internet, what is that? How do you define that? It's like, just make it open. Okay, yeah, but what are you saying? What are you actually saying? It's been very interesting, particularly when I was working in a minister's office, to watch the debate through the eyes of someone who could see how it was being interpreted by, those people who are actually making those decisions. Because when you have just a open versus closed, it was like the filter. You had people that I knew to be very, very well informed, putting forward arguments, but basically saying, well, the others are just religious, so just ignore them. You had the other ones who, their arguments really, when you broke it down, weren't all that good, but the way it was put forward was exactly the same way. So from a person who didn't actually know, it was like two extremes. If we get somewhere in the middle, then that's probably the most democratic process, isn't it? So it's sometimes very hard to try to remind people that you need to make sure you engage constructively, because if you come across as just as crazy as the other people, then you're going to be dismissed just as easily as the other people. So we started talking about, well, let's try and define some basic principles of the internet. And we went back to IETF and we went back to a lot of the founding kind of concepts, because the idea was, if you can actually create a baseline and you can say, well, here are some founding principles. Now we can use these principles to actually hold policy and legislation and government decisions or whatever up against to see whether it holds true. So the ones we came up with just very briefly were coordination, not control, so committing to protecting coordination efforts and commitment to participation in coordination, rather than just saying, well, we'll just do it our way and you do it your way or whatever, and coordinating with people who actually run infrastructure and with the community. So, it seems like a basic premise to us because, we do open source, but for a lot of government people that's rather odd. Interoperability, of course, was a big one. This concept of peer-to-peer global connectivity, the capacity to route around damage, distributed control, and a non-discriminatory approach were the key principles that we came up with. And then we sort of started looking at, okay, well, what are the social and economic benefits of each one of these? Because then what you can do is when someone comes out with a policy like the filter policy, you can say, well, this would impact upon these three principles, and if you impact upon those three principles, then that'll have this social and economic outcome, which is why we really shouldn't do this. creating that greater maturity to the debate so we can actually back up what we're saying with a little bit more meat is going to be what really helps us sort of push back in a meaningful way on this stuff when it comes up, particularly given the fact that we've got people coming out and saying, well, governments have to intercede because, of course, we're the only representative bodies. So it'd be worth checking that out, and I'll post some links about this later. But to just jump back to the distributed democracy angle for a second. So then going back to Sarkozy's comment, what I would love to do is, well, actually, just step back for one more second. I joked about the singularity before. I guess I was having a chat to a mate about, singularity and how the word has just become so abused, as so many things do. It's become quite hyped, and there's a lot of people that are like, well, singularity is when we're going to get uploaded into the vast consciousness, and then the matrix will explode, and then ponies and something. And then there's other people talking about, when the robots take over and finally we all die and perish in the Terminator and Skynet. And there's a lot of different things. And we were talking about, but all of those things are, well, maybe they won't necessarily be, but they're sort of symptoms of what it actually is. And the whole concept of singularity, of course, is when the things that separate things disappear and they come together. So whether that's a device to a device or a person to a device or whatever. I mean, embedded computing obviously is a form of getting the singularity because you've got nothing in between you and your hardware, effectively. So I started thinking about the concept of democratic singularity. Right? Because, of course, now citizens are closer to the process of democracy than ever before. We can see what's going on, we can engage with our representatives, we can participate in the policy development, to more or less degree, a lot, and not to where we should be, but a lot more than ever before. And that distance between the citizen and the democracy is rapidly closing, which is, I think, kind of exciting. So one of the concepts I started playing with, and it's not a new concept, a lot of people have thought about this concept, so I'm not purporting to have invented it or anything, but this idea of a distributed democracy, which again, I'm very much taking from a Stevenson book as well, and there's a bunch of projects around the world sort of playing with this, but the concept is, well, why wouldn't we have an online representative body which engages in international trade agreements, which engages in international debate about policy on internet controls or how things are going to work, which basically we participate in and could be run as a true open governance representative model, and at the same time it actually holds the meat space governments, I guess, a little bit more to account, and actually starts to create and enforce and be a watchdog for that baseline that I was talking about before. So I think there's some good opportunities for that. I'll give you a little bit of examples. I actually put up a wiki about this ages ago and then didn't come back to it. But one of the things I want to do a little bit later this year is a hacking democracy kind of weekend of some sort, where we just sort of say, okay, well, if this model was to exist, how, what would it do? What would the point be? How could it operate? Would it be effective? Just sort of going through some of those questions and starting to plot out whether we can actually build a model. And maybe we can't. Maybe we sort of look at it and go, actually, there's no point. Let's just continue to, wave our placards and stuff. But I think that I think that there could be some merit in the idea. So I'll take you through some of the original ideas for the scope of such an idea. It could be a body that maintained a working definition for the technical and social characteristics essential to the internet, and then be a body that actually uses that baseline to analyse policy and legislation from governments all around the world and start to actually create a bit of a league table on which countries are doing best or worst in this space. It could be, so monitor and report the actions of governments, organisations, and the organisations bit I think is important as well, because it's very hard for meat space governments to hold corporates to account in terms of our online rights, because they just go and shift to another jurisdiction. It's very, very, very hard to actually to encourage corporates to do I guess the right thing in that kind of way. But this could be a body that could help with that, and it could actively engage with governments and organisations to advocate on behalf of online citizens. It could be, who knows, it could be a UN recognised country. We could be, we all have dual citizenship. I've got citizenship to my meat space, and I've got citizenship to my digital space. I think, that could be kind of fun to stir things up a little. And I'm nothing if not a troublemaker, I'm sure, as you've figured out. It could engage in international dialogue and treaties and agreements on behalf of the online community. It could be lobbying for the running of and democratically run core internet infrastructure. How's that for an interesting idea? We have core internet infrastructure, which is absolutely vital to everything, being effectively run and controlled by, let's not point fingers, but like a small number of people. So maybe this is a way to actually answer that question, rather than trying to centralise Debilio and then still have it, as a anyway. Maybe that's an interesting conversation to have. We could provide tools and instructions to citizens to uphold their rights online, and then again I'm getting into troublemaking, but and create obligations and civic responsibilities for members of the online community. Possibly, like this concept of it's not just about rights, it's also about responsibilities, and that sort of idea. So that's the concept of a. Would anyone here be interested in a hacking democracy kind of event? 1, 2, 3. Okay, all right. There's one, and I've got 10 minutes. You're just saying 10 minutes. You don't actually want a digital democracy.
I want a hack democracy. No, not me.
And why?
Who wants to put a time limit on democracy?
Why do you hate freedom? Anyway.
Evolve it.
Sorry?
Can we not evolve democracy? Yes.
Meat-based democracy? Do you think meat-based democracy will ever actually be able to represent us online properly?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the censorship. It sounds like you're trying to create some type of layer of censorship.
Wow, you picked the last sentence of the entire speech, and that's the only thing that you're talking about. Seriously? What's the censorship?
Because that red flag. There's a red flag there, and I want to.
That one sentence.
I create a lot of really controversial stuff online.
Yeah, sure.
There's not many people that can say there's people all around the world that want them dead.
All right, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting we create an organisation for censorship. There's plenty of those already. Yeah?
It's suggesting a democracy though, which is control.
Does it have to be?
Then what's the point of it?
The point of it is to actually be a legitimate representative body to actually make sure that these other mechanisms that are happening regardless, the way that internet infrastructure is run for starters, the trade agreements that are happening regardless, the international policy and bilateral trade agreements that actually put in place things that actually affect us quite significantly, to make sure that there is actually a voice in that room that actually represents our online rights. That's the concept. And I mean, and again, I could be completely wrong. And if you all think I'm wrong, then that's cool. That's democracy in action. But that's the concept. The concept is not to create more trouble for ourselves and more bureaucracy. In fact, it may not even be a government per se. But the thing is that you've got the EFFs and EFAs of the world. You've got a whole bunch of lobbying organisations. I guess what I think is possibly missing is a representative voice for that aspect of our lives at the moment. That's just an idea. What are your thoughts? This is cool. Yes? Oh, sorry. By the way, I'm going to repeat questions for the recording, which I totally forgot about, so thank you very much. So I'll repeat the questions, please.
I had 2 questions. One, the core infrastructure you talked about was never set up as something that was anything other than they're subsidized, but they're pretty much all for-profit companies that build and run the infrastructure. Is that true?
The question is whether it's true that the organisations that will run the core infrastructure are not-for-profit organisations. Sorry, for-profit is what you're saying. Is that true?
I believe that's true. I believe that all the people who are doing the big pieces, building the pipelines, keeping the servers running, they may be subsidized by governments, but they're generally for-profit companies.
I don't know if I can say all, because I know of at least a couple that are definitely non-profit. So I guess the answer is no, because I know a couple that are non-profit. But yeah, I think generally speaking, a lot of them are for-profit.
Yeah, they might be for-profit, but they're mostly not public. This would all require some kind of expropriation, right? For any kind of...
Oh, it's not a small project. I mean, it's really just a conceptual thing at the moment, because the idea is that, yeah, you're right, there's not a lot... sorry, the question was about transparency. The question was about a whole bunch of things. So yeah, maybe we do need that microphone. I'm really bad. The transparency question, I think, is a big part of it. The representativeness and accountability for decisions made is part of it.
The second half, I guess my comment was that some famous person, I forget who, said something about rights are just nonsense on stilts or something like that.
Rights are nonsense on stilts.
So
Okay.
it's like...
That was actually, if I can intervene, that was Jeremy Bentham, and he's also the person who invented the panopticon.
Yeah, there you go.
And he meant it for good.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
The prisoner was supposed to have quiet reflection.
Yeah. I don't know if that's entirely a fair thing to say, that rights are something on stilts because, and the reason I say that because where there are countries where there are actually defined rights, they are used as a defence to maintaining those rights in a legal sense. And so I think that they can be effective. I also think they can be destructive as well, though, because if people see a right... okay, I'm going to give a very quick story as a metaphor because I can't explain it very well right now, but I was on a plane in the US and there was a woman, a very heavily pregnant woman in a chair, and the woman in front of her chair, you know, she accidentally bumped her. Flying in the US domestic is horrendous. If anyone's ever done it, it's awful. And she bumped her once, and the person in front just sort of bridled, and then she bumped her again, a second time, but not huge deal, whatever. And the person in front stood up and started screaming at her. I mean, this is it's just rage, whatever. But the fact that she was quoting her rights, and then the person behind was, look, I'm really sorry, I'm heavily pregnant, I didn't mean it. And she's like, well, that's not my problem, but this concept that I have a right to not engage in any way, like to not be impacted by anything that's happening around me, or to take responsibility for the impact I have on anything around me. I'm not saying that I know the better way, and I'm not saying there is a better way, and I think rights are very, very important, but I think that there's something missing slightly in that approach, but I'm not sure what. Sorry.
Just thinking about the broader ethical structure of what you're proposing, apart from the issues with implementation.
Yeah.
People who are online are generally on a global scale our interests are the most well represented of anyone in the world, while there are definitely some problems with internet legislation and our ability to share cat videos online and all that kind of stuff. Setting up another body to represent our interests more separate from like people who are not able to get online or who are less involved in internet culture, how might we address some of the ethical problems with that?
Goodness, we're getting down into the detail. I'm obviously in a technical crowd. So, to answer the basic premise of the question, which is about, the premise of the question is actually about, we're already represented online. So, why would we do...
More represented than others.
Yeah, well, no, but the problem is with the term represented. I mean, we're online. We're talking, we're farting, we're blogging, we're friggin' tweeting, we're all the identitying. We're doing all those things, but how much that translates into being represented or representing ourselves or having our perspective represented in the decision-making processes that then go on and affect us is, I think, a very different question. And that's the question that I'm looking at. Because, we can say whatever we like, and we do, very loudly sometimes, but the impact that has is an entirely different thing. So I'm not suggesting that we need, another way to talk. We have plenty. I'm suggesting that our perspective is not making it through to those decision-making processes. That's just my thought. Yeah.
I find your project very fascinating because I do the same thing except from a different point of view through education, actually. But I'm an online teacher, and I'm trying to figure out ways to make it receptive to become an entertainment source, and I'm trying to eventually replace television to be an educational platform that we can utilize throughout the structures of our internet. And the way I look at it, because you say this democracy, and that's what I'm basing everything on. So we got John Locke and the history of philosophy, and Plato with the academy, and this is the enlightenment that we're seeing right now, or at least the catalyst for it. But I see it developing into a meritocracy, which means those who actually have the talent to receptively convey these messages to the entire world. And then I see that opening up into an open source republic, because if we did this, if we freed education, both literally, metaphorically, and allegorically, then we would see a chain reaction that would cause, that would induce all that you're saying.
Absolutely, and I mean, like, one of my favorite, because I do love to quote Machiavelli, I have to say, and one of my favorite Machiavelli quotes is that a uninformed population is one of the big killers of democracy. Of course, the other two things he said was the republic system itself, because it was cannibalizing itself, and Catholicism, as it turns out. But that was one of his arguments, which I found very interesting. But the main one was that lack of education. I massively agree. Not just getting information to people, but actual education of people, because there is quite a different. People have access to torrents, if you don't mind the pun, of information constantly. But there's a massive difference between being able to read the latest of I don't know, whoever's famous right now, and being actually educated about a better way to think, a better way to do things. I think that's
We have
vital.
to relearn how to utilize the
Yeah.
internet. Right now, our internet is full of trolls, and people that want to teach online will end up getting trolled. Even like I teach for free, I don't ask for anything of anyone. Yet I get there's trolls that just want to make me look bad. But I mean, what they do, they don't realize my content, which is talking about why they're trolling people.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of funny.
It's ironic trolling,
They
really.
prove what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a very important point. Thank you.
How would this be different to Reddit activism?
Sorry, say that again?
How would this be different to Reddit activism?
I guess the only difference between this and there's plenty of activism, and there's plenty of and of all the activism, there's a small proportion of it that's vaguely that's actually very successful at what it's trying to achieve. A lot of activism, unfortunately, I think ends up fulfilling people's sense of doing something, but how much it actually changes is very, very difficult to measure. And I'm not suggesting that this is not that this is going to fix all that. I'm not suggesting this is a panacea at all. I don't know if I just used the right word, but I think it's the right word. But thank you. So I see this as mildly different only in that it's not just individuals being empowered to do cool stuff. It becomes that mechanism to say, actually, legitimately we can, represent en masse as a community of people who do have, regardless of our culture, geography, blah, 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 common needs as online citizens. And those online needs need to probably be defined and need to be put forward as a baseline that international decision-making treaties, blah, 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 shouldn't cross. At the moment, a lot of the, as you call it, Reddit activism or just general activism online focuses on one issue and sort of goes deep. One of the things I've noticed, and I could be completely wrong again, but the internet industry, generally speaking, has a lot of organisations that are very deep, and they sort of say, well, we don't need to look at content filtering because we just look at the domain administration, domain name administration. We don't need to look at this because we just look at this. And what's happened is a lot of these organisations have created forts around themselves and do not engage with other aspects of internet policy because they think that they're protected because they're only looking at this aspect. A policy by a government will cut through all of those simultaneously. If it touches them, those forts are gone as the straw that they currently are. But they think that it's protecting themselves by just staying within their domain. But there needs, I think, to be a more cohesive approach to saying it affects us all, and so we need to actually come together to define those things and actually fight back a little bit, or at least create some lines in the sand that we can defend. Maybe, I don't know. Does that answer your question at all? It's a bit. I think it's different because it's a en masse thing rather than an individual thing.
Is it a framework of policy that you're trying to, like, the framework?
Now, whoever has,
We've only got a couple of comments left.
and whoever has the content, you should put your hand up, or I don't know where you are. Hi.
I hardly know where to start. You just you bring up so much. But what I'd like to know is you advocate doing things a different way, which I totally agree with. Like I have this dream of the internet of the 1990s where no commercial activity is allowed. Because I think it worked really well then because commercial activity and they can go for it. I could care less if they do that, but it implies power. And there will always be people who abuse the power and things like that. So I'd rather see a totally not-for-profit internet, maybe running in parallel, whatever. But what intrigues me about what you're saying is two things. First of all, the last stat I heard was over 70% of the population of the planet does not have any access to networks and could give us stuff about this. And, things like poverty and hunger, just overshadow things like us playing on the internet by a major amount. But the thing that worries me when I listen to you is I'm all for what you're talking about. What makes you think that the same issues that we have now wouldn't just come up in a new structure? Because surely the people who, if you could go back and listen to like the founding fathers of America in private over coffee or something, you probably would have heard the same exact kind of conversations you're having. England is taxing us without representation. We need a new government, and it should be for all the people, and it should, and we hate government. Even though we are the government. I hate this talk about the government like there's some scary monster entity out there. Well, no. You know, Kate Lundy is my representative. She rows on the lake in the morning. I can call her up. I can send her an email. You know, it's not some little monster. It is people that we selected to go represent us.
I agree.
So what makes you think that, you know, you wouldn't have the same exact issues?
So I'm going to take the first point first, which is about how representative it can be when the whole planet's not online. And my answer to that is if we wait for everyone to get online before we start actually trying to draw a line in the sand, then they're all buggered before they even get on. The second point, and we don't pretend to represent people that aren't online, but at the same time, like trying to actually draw a line, I think, is not necessarily a bad idea, but if you wait for everyone, then you don't even get to start to have that debate. In terms of how you can stop it being, changed into something that you're trying to avoid, I don't know, for me it's an interesting thought experiment really at this point in time, and it really is. I mean, you've got to remember this doesn't exist yet. It's very much just a thought experiment. But my thought is this, that the democracies around the world are very new. Oh, sorry, not very new. They're reasonably old, certainly by digital standards or internet standards. But and they were pretty much all invented way before these the change to society of these massive distribution of all the traditional power bastions of society were happened. And so for me, there's an interesting thought experiment in the concept of sitting down and saying, well, if we could do the perfect open government or the perfect open representative body or the perfect representative body of some sort, then what would it look like? So, I mean, there's almost, for me, there's sort of a process there to go through, because I don't know that it should... And it's funny, because when I talk to the people about this concept of a representative body, they go, yeah, but the moment I say government, whoa. And that to me actually represents part of the problem, because we see governments as these for a lot of people, the very concept of government is something that regulates and something that enforces. Whereas for me, the concept's a little bit like, for everyone, they have a different definition of government. So the moment you throw government into the mix, it screws up, and I'm being ushered on. So sorry. Last question.
Hi. So if you're talking about a representative body, if you wanted to do that without compromising some of the principles you're trying to defend, like anonymity, do you have any thoughts about how you would model something like identity or citizenship and protect it from fraud and things like that while maintaining those principles?
Yeah. And it's a really interesting question, because we started playing with some of those concepts. The answer is I don't have an answer yet, and I've been bouncing this idea off a bunch of people. I actually sat and had a 2 or 3 hour conversation with Jake Applebaum, and of course that was one of the first things that he brought up, and it's a really good question. And some of it might be putting in place mechanisms that make it hard, for instance, for bots to participate, but at the same time, how do you do that but maintain anonymity, but at the same time make it so that, well, one person who's not a bot can still go and set up 20,000 accounts and all that kind of stuff? How do you balance out making sure that there's enough? Maybe you have like 2 houses. You have like a house which is geographically based, so you have a certain amount of representatives per region, and then you have a Senate, which is your popular vote. I don't know. And the way for people to be able to participate in that so it can't be too easily gamed is very, very challenging. But you would want to protect anonymity as a way to participate in this, because for some people, even participating in anything with the word, democracy or representativeness or, even internet is going to be dangerous for their persons. So, there's a whole conversation there to have, and I'd really love to have it, but I'm going to have to leave now.
You are. All right.